The woman who would not have me handed me an oar and told me I was holding it backwards. I had been standing on the drove for an hour by then, watching the sea come in over a road. That is what Muirholt does. At low water there is a track of grey stone running out across the flats from the coast road to Fair Landing, 3/4 of a mile of it, wide enough for 2 carts abreast, laid down by nobody anyone remembers. Men drive their oyster carts on it, and children walk it barefoot, and a fool on a fine afternoon can stand in the middle of it and look at the mud going out flat and shining on both sides of him to the edge of the sky, and think that he has understood the place. Then the tide turns. It does not rush. It comes up over the stone the way a big man walks into a room he owns without hurrying, without any interest at all in who else is standing there. And in 10 minutes there is no road, and there has never been a road, and the water is 4 feet deep over it and running like a river. I was the fool. I had ridden ahead of my own marriage procession because I wanted to see the country before the country saw me. I had sent my horse back with the boy at the coast road, in a borrowed coat, with 3 days of beard on my face, and I had walked out onto the drove with the idea that a king ought once in his life to arrive somewhere on his own 2 feet. I got a third of the way. I stopped to look at a heron standing in 6 inches of water with the whole enormous silver flat behind it, and not one other living thing between me and Fair Landing. And I stood there longer than I meant to, because it was the first quiet hour I had had in 11 years. When I looked down, the stone under my boots had gone dark. There was water in the seams of it. It was coming from behind me, and it was coming from in front of me, and it was, I discovered with a lurch, already up over the low place 50 yards back the way I had come, and moving. I turned round twice, like a horse in a burning stable. I am not proud of that either. The punt came out of the light from the town side. It came fast, and it made no noise, and there was a woman standing in the stern of it, pawing. She was tall. She was not young, and she was not old. She was somewhere in the middle of her life, where people stop being one thing and become simply themselves. She wore a man's canvas coat cut down and restitched to fit her, salt-stiff to the elbow, and a knife on her belt with a blade worn thin as a fingernail from 30 years of sharpening. Her hair was in a knot that had given up. She brought the punt alongside the stone without once looking at the stone. She looked at my boots. 2 coppers, she said. The water was over my ankles. I don't have 2 coppers. Then you'd better be strong. She held out the oar. I took it. And then, because I have been the alpha king of this kingdom for 11 years, and in all that time not one person alive has told me anything with that particular flatness, the flatness of a woman telling a post it is crooked, she reached over, took the oar in her own hand, turned it around inside my fists, and said, "Backwards." That is the first thing Tamsin Farrow ever said to me. Not my lord, not sire, not even sir. Backwards. I got into the boat. It was a long, flat black box, tarred to the gunwales, with a name burned crooked into the middle thwart, Nettle. There was a coil of rope in the bow, a stone anchor, 2 rakes, and a wet dog. The dog looked at me and decided against me and put its head back down on the rope. She poled from the stern. I had never watched anyone do it properly before. There is a rhythm to it that is not rowing and not punting a river. You set the pole, you walk the boat past it, you lift, you set again, and the flat water goes under you in long shoves, and the whole business looks so unremarkable that a man watching from a throne would think anyone could do it. I rowed on the port side badly, and the current of the incoming tide took the bow and swung it, and she corrected without comment, and the shore of Fair Landing came at us sideways. "Shorter stroke," she said once. I shortened it. The rest of the crossing she said nothing at all. I sat in the bow of that boat with my back to her, pulling an oar I had held the wrong way round 5 minutes earlier, and the great silver flats went out on either side of us to the horizon, and behind us the drove was gone as though it had been a rumor, and I was I did not have a word for it then, and I have hunted one for 19 years. I was nobody, and it was the most extraordinary feeling I had had since I was a boy. Halfway across she said, "You're a hand." I understood, after a moment, that she was asking whether I was a laborer come to the estuary looking for work. Now I want to be exact about this, because everything that followed hung on it, and because I do not wish to be admired for any part of it. I did not lie to her. I have never lied to her, not once in all the years since. What I did was smaller than a lie, and I have come to think worse. I said nothing, and I let a woman look at 3 days of beard and a borrowed coat and mud to the knee and do the arithmetic that any sensible person in the world would do, and when she arrived at the wrong answer, I did not correct it. "I can lift," I said. "Everybody can lift." She leaned into the pole. "Can you get up before the tide does?" "Yes." "Then you're a hand," said Tamsin Farrow. "Fire's lit. Don't eat all the bread." And that is how the Alpha King of Muirholt came into fair landing, sitting in the bow of a ferry punt, with an oar the right way round at last, hired for his supper by a woman who had not asked his name. I had come because my council had found me a wife. They had been finding me wives for 11 years, and I had been sending them home, and I had begun to be a joke about it in my own hall, and I did not much mind. This one they had not so much found as engineered, the way you engineer a sea wall. Her name was Ondine Varick, and her father held the tide charters of the whole eastern estuary, which is to say he held the salt barges, and the oyster beds and the barrels, and the coopers who made the barrels, and the men who rolled them, and lately, a good many of the crossings. "Marry the Varricks," said my counsel, "and the eastern water is quiet for 40 years. I did not want a quiet water. I wanted to know why, in 11 years, the sworn men of Fair Landing had stopped coming to the summer muster, why the tolls out of that estuary had doubled, while the tally of registered boats had halved, why every letter I received from the landing read as though it had been written by one hand with a different name signed at the bottom of it, and why, when I sent a man down to look, he came back and told me everything was in excellent order and could not meet my eye. So I told my marshal that I would ride ahead. He argued for 2 hours. I let him argue, and then I did it anyway, which is the whole method of kingship, and I do not recommend it. Now the other thing. I will tell it here, while I am still a ragged hand in the bow of a boat, and not yet a king in a cloak, because it will be easier for you to hear it from him than from me. Since my father died, I have had a tremor in my hands. It is not much. It is enough. It comes in the mornings, and after long councils, and above all when I must hold a pen and sign my name at the foot of a document while 5 men watch. It came the winter after we buried him, and it has never once come in battle, which I used to think was a joke at my expense, and now think was the whole of the diagnosis. I hid it for 4 years by the ordinary cowardice of a strong man. I held things: a cup, a rein, a hilt, a glove, the arm of a chair. If a man is always holding something, nobody ever sees his hands. I told no physician. I told no priest of the moon, and I told no friend, and I certainly told no counsel, because a king with unsteady hands is a king with an unsteady kingdom in the mouths of men who want a different one. I decided, alone, at about 2 in the morning on some night I no longer remember, that this was the price of the crown, and that I would pay it and never mention it. And I built my entire bearing on a lie so small that in 4 years not one living soul had looked directly at it. My wolf had nothing to say about any of this. He had lain in me those 11 years like a stone in a boot, present, unhelpful, silent. Other alphas speak of their wolves the way men speak of brothers. Mine had not risen for anything since my father's pyre. I had stopped expecting him to. That is the man who stepped out of a ferry punt onto the shingle at Fair, landing on the 9th day of Midsummer Week. A big shaking liar with a borrowed coat and no coppers, and every reason in the world to think he was the most complicated thing on that beach. Fair Landing has no ceiling. That is the first thing to understand about it, and the last, and I did not understand it for 12 days. Every other town in my kingdom has a hall, a gate, a roof, somewhere the important business goes on out of the weather and out of sight. The landing has a shingle beach, a curve of tarred wooden houses standing on stilts above the high-water line, a shed for the harbor-master, a chapel with no door, and 200 boats. Whatever is done there is done in the sun. Whatever is said where the ill seller can hear it. The whole town smelled of salt and oyster shell and hot tar. There were nets over everything. There were barrels, stacks of them to the eaves of the houses, and coopers working in the open with their sleeves rolled, and a boy walking a hoop of them down the shingle. There were 3 enormous flat salt barges tied at the deep-water staith with a red pennant on each mast, and on the deck of the nearest one, a broad, slow-shouldered man was sitting on a coil of rope doing nothing whatsoever. "That's Padraig," said Tamsin, following my eye, and hauled a rake out of the boat and gave it to me. "Don't stare at him. He's ashamed enough." "What's he ashamed of?" "Not working," she said, and went up the beach. The Pharaoh house was the last one but 2 at the northern end, up on its stilts, with the shingle running under it, and a sail rigged as an awning over the seaward side, and a black rope of dried bladder-wrack hung on the door for the weather. There was a hearthstone. There was a table her father had made with the initials of somebody's daughter carved under the edge of it where a child had thought nobody would look. She stopped at the foot of the steps, sat down, and pulled her boots off before she went up. I watched her do it. Then, feeling as a man does when the rules of a house have been shown to him without a word, I sat down on the step and pulled off mine. She glanced back once and said nothing and went in. Later, much later, years later, when we had been married a long time and she had drunk a little wine, I asked her why the boots. "Because my father liked a dry hearth," she said, "and because I wanted to see whether you'd copy me." There was fish stew and there was bread. She cut the bread and there was one heel and she put it in front of me. I did not know then what that was. In fair landing, the heel of the loaf is for the man who has done the day's work. Her father had eaten it for 30 years, and she had handed it, without any ceremony at all, to a stranger who had rowed badly on the port side for 3/4 of a mile. The dog came and lay against my boot, having reconsidered. "He's called Kip," she said. "He's no use. He seems useful enough. He can't swim." She said this the way you would report a death in a family. "A dog on a ferry. He fell in at Candlemas and I went in after him and my father laughed until he had to sit down." She stopped. She looked at the fire for a while. Then she stood up and took the pot off the hook and said, "You'll sleep under the sail. There's a blanket in the chest. If it rains, come in and sit by the door and don't wake me." It did not rain. I lay under a sail on a shingle beach in my own kingdom with a dog that could not swim across my legs, and the tide going out under the house all night with a long soft hiss like grain poured slowly from a sack, and I looked up at the underside of the canvas and did not sleep for a long time. I got up in the dark because I heard her get up. There was no lamp. She came down the steps with her boots in her hand and a rake over her shoulder, and stopped when she saw me standing on the shingle. "You're up. You said before the tide." "So I did," said Tamsin, and something happened at the corner of her mouth that was not a smile, and was closer to one than anything I would get for a week. "Bring the second rake." The oyster beds of the Bright Flats lie a half-mile out and they are worked at the bottom of the tide, in the dark, in about 2 feet of water, and I would not have believed how cold it is in the 3rd week of midsummer. You wade. You find the bed by the feel of it under your boots, a change from silt to a hard rubble of shell, and you set the rake and you drag it toward you, and it comes up loaded and streaming and enormously heavy, and you break the clumps against your knee and throw the small ones back and put the big ones in the basket you are dragging behind you on a rope. And then you do it again, and again, and again, and the sky goes from black to gray to a color with no name. And your arms stop being arms and become 2 objects you are renting. I had been at it perhaps an hour when I stopped. I was standing in the water with the rake in both hands and the light just coming, and the flats going out silver and endless in every direction, and Tamsin 20 feet away with her back to me breaking a clump on her knee, and I was looking down at my hands. They were still. Not steady. A man can make himself steady. I have made myself steady in front of ambassadors. It is a thing you do with the shoulders, and it costs you the whole day. Still, the tremor was not being fought. It was not there. It had gone out of me the way a coin goes out of a pocket unnoticed, and I had not the faintest idea when. I stood in the water for so long that she straightened up and looked at me. "If you've cut yourself," she said, "say so now and not at supper." "I haven't cut myself." "Then rake." I raked. We came in with 3 baskets on the turn of the tide, and by the time the sun was properly up she had washed, changed her coat, and taken Nettle out to the drove for the first crossing of the day, and I sat on the shingle with my hands in front of me like a man reading a letter in a language he used to know. I learned fair landing the way you learn anything, slowly, and in the wrong order, and mostly by carrying things. I learned that the Faro crossing had run for 30 years and had always had 2 poles, a boat that size wants 2 in a hard tide, and that the second pole had been Padraig Mund, a broad, slow, decent man who had worked beside Odell Faro since he was 15, and who had been hired away in the spring by Coyle Varick at 3 times his wage, and now sat on a barrel on a barge deck all day and did nothing that could be called work, and looked out at the flats. "He came to me after," said Tamsin when I finally asked. "She was mending a net, stood down there at the bottom of the steps in the rain, said would I forgive him, said his wife's chest is bad and the money was 3 times. "What did you say?" "I said there's nothing to forgive and get out of the rain." She bit the twine. "He'd rather I'd shouted. Everyone would rather you shouted. Then it's a quarrel and it's finished." She held the net up to the light. "It isn't a quarrel, it's just what happened." I learned that the Varick punts had begun, that spring, to leave the landing at the exact hours the Faro punt left, and go to the exact place the Faro punt went, and charge 1 copper where the Faro punt charged 2. Not a rule broken, not a law bent. Only a boy of 26 standing on the stayth with his thumbs in his belt, watching a woman pole out with an empty punt and smiling at her pleasantly as she passed, and not saying 1 word. I learned that Tamsin woke at the hour the tide told her, and never 1 minute after in any weather, without complaint or comment, and that in 12 days she never once said she was tired, and that this was not a virtue she was performing but simply a fact about her, like her height. I learned that she talked to the dog and not to me. I learned that on the 4th night there were 2 heels of the loaf, because the bread had broken badly, and she put both of them on my plate and ate the middle, and I have been given kingdoms with less meaning in the giving. And I learned by the 5th day that she had never once asked me my name. I asked her why. She had the net across her knees and her hands going, and her hands are like a cooper's square, split at the knuckles, a shining burn scar down the ball of the left thumb from a rope run out too fast in some year before I existed to her. "If you wanted to say it," she said, "you'd have said it. Most people ask." "Most people are lonely," said Tamsin Faro and bit the twine. I have sat in war councils where 4 kingdoms argued for 11 hours by the candle. I have never in my life been so completely and so kindly defeated in so few words. On the 6th day I made her laugh once, and I have never worked so hard for anything. We were shifting barrels, empty ones, up from the shingle to the cooper's shed, which is dull, heavy, stupid work, and the sort of work in which men talk. I had asked her in a roundabout way about the landing right. "It's not a paper," she said. "There's no roll, nothing written." "Then what is it?" She stopped with a barrel on her hip and looked at me as though I had asked what the sea was. "It's the fair," she said. "Midsummer's Eve at the Salt Fair. Ansel Krebs stands up and calls the crossings one after another and asks the fare, and if the hands go up you may carry passengers and take coin for it, and if they don't you may not. That's all it is. That's all it's ever been. 300 years. She rolled the barrel up onto the stack. My father used to say it's the only thing in Muirholt a rich man can't buy because there's nothing there to buy. There's just 200 hands in the air. I said without thinking, that is the most dangerous law I have ever heard of. And Tamsin Farrow put her hands on the small of her back and laughed at me, one short surprised note of it, up into the blue sky over that town with no ceiling, and said, "You're a strange sort of hand," and picked up the next barrel. I lay awake under the sail that night and thought about a law that lives only in 200 pairs of hands and can be taken away by 200 people deciding, on a warm afternoon, to keep them at their sides. And I thought, nobody is coming to take her boat, nobody will break anything, nobody in this town has to do a single wrong thing. Then I thought about Farron Varick standing on the stave with his thumbs in his belt, smiling pleasantly, saying nothing. And I got up in the dark and stood on the shingle looking out at the flats, where the tide was coming in over the drove in the moonlight the way it had come in over me, unhurried, uninterested, and I said aloud to nobody, "Midsummer's Eve is in 3 days." Behind me, from the dark under the house, Kip thumped his tail twice against the boards. The fog came up on the 7th night with no warning at all, which is what fog does in an estuary. It does not arrive, it is simply there, the way a thought is there. We had gone out for the late crossing. There is one every night in the fair week, the last boat off the drove, because men come down the coast road from the inland farms with their carts and their oysters in vinegar and their sacks of buttons and their 2-year-old ale, and they always, every one of them, arrive too late for the road. It is not carelessness. They do it on purpose. If you cross on the last boat, you are already at the landing when the fair wakes, and you have your pitch, and the man behind you has the shingle. So Tamsin kept the last boat. Her father had kept it. That night there were 3 of them waiting for us on the stone with a handcart between them, 2 brothers off a hill farm and an old man with a crate of pullets, and the fog came down between the drove and the town while we were still loading. I felt it before I saw it. The light went. The lantern in the bow, which had been throwing a yellow circle on the black water, stopped throwing anything at all and simply sat there being a lantern, a small bright useless thing with a wall around it, and the shore of Fair Landing, which I had been watching over her shoulder, 400 yards off, 20 lit windows, was gone as though someone had drawn a hand across it. The old man with the pullets said, "Ah, now." "Sit down," said Tamsin. "I've crossed this water 40. Sit down, Hallam, or get out and walk on it." He sat down. Everybody sat down. I stood because I did not know I was supposed to sit, and she said, "Not you. Bo, take the pole and hold it straight up and don't move it." I went into the bow and held the pole straight up like a fool with a flagstaff, and understood after 10 seconds exactly what it was for. She had put a mark in the sky. She could see the top of it against the last gray of the fog above us, and as long as she could see it, she knew where the front of her boat was, and that was the entire extent of what she could know. Then she began to pole. I want to describe this properly, because I have thought about it more than almost anything else in my life, and because it is the reason I did what I did afterwards. She could not see. Not the shore, not the water past the gunwale, not me at 12 feet. There is no channel marked on the bright flats. There are 3, and they move, and between them there is mud that will hold a punt like a fist. The tide was 2 hours up and running hard. She had a boat with 3 passengers and a handcart and a crate of pullets in it, and she had no light, and she had no landmark, and she had a stranger in the bow. And she was not doing anything difficult. That is what I could not get past. She poled and she counted, I heard her once under her breath, a number, and every so often she lifted the pole and let it fall, and I heard it find the bottom, and she read the bottom through 11 feet of ash the way a man reads a page. Hard shell, the kettle. Soft, sucking, the pole coming out slow, the mud off the lane bank. She turned the boat 6 times. Nobody spoke. The pullets shifted and grumbled. And after what I would have sworn was an hour and was in truth about 20 minutes, she said, in an ordinary voice, "Hallam, get your feet under you." And the shingle came up out of the fog and touched the boat like an animal putting its nose in your hand. We were 40 feet from the Faro steps. The old man got out. The brothers got out and hauled their cart up the beach, and one of them turned round and said, "Night, Tam." And that was all night, Tam, as though she had passed him the salt. I stood in the boat with the pole in my hands. She was coiling the bowline. I said, "How did you do that?" "Do what?" "You couldn't see." "No." "Then how?" "29 years," said Tamsin Farrow, and stepped up onto the shingle in the fog and went to see about the fire. I sat down on the thwart of that punt, and I put my face in my hands, and I stayed there some time. I was the king of Muirholt. I had a marshal and a chancellor of the salt, and a whole council of men who could tell you the tonnage of every barge on the eastern water and the name of every ship's master. And every one of them had told me, in one way or another, that Fair Landing was a rough little town of no consequence that could be tidied up nicely by a good marriage. And there was a woman on that shingle who could bring 3 passengers and a crate of hens home across a moving tide in a fog by counting. And there was not a man in my hall who knew her name, and there was not a line about her anywhere in the whole written kingdom. And if she stopped, nothing would be written about that either. I had genuinely thought, riding down the coast road, that I was coming to find out what was wrong with Fair Landing. I sat in the dark in her boat, and understood that I had come to find out what was wrong with the way I saw. She fed me. She always fed me. She never once mentioned that a man who has no coppers eats no supper. The 8th day was hot and blue, and the whole beach smelled of tar, because the coopers were burning barrel hoops, and a boy came down to the shingle wanting to cross. He was 6, perhaps 7. He had a shirt too big for him and a face washed by somebody in a hurry that morning, and he had walked down the beach from the far end where the poorest houses stand on the lowest stilts, and he stopped at the bottom of the Faro steps with his fist closed. I was tarring the punt. You do it every fair week. You get the boat up on the shingle at low water, and you go over the seams with a brush and a pot, and I had my sleeves rolled and my arms black to the elbow, and I was, I remember, extremely pleased with myself about it. "Mrs. Farrow," said the boy. "Tamsin," said Tamsin without looking up. "Tamsin," he opened his fist, "there was 1 copper in it. I want to go over the water." She stopped brushing. She sat back on her heels. "Where over the water, comb?" "My auntie." "Which auntie is that?" "My ma'am's sister." He said this to his boots. "At Cobb." Cobb is a farm 4 miles up the coast road on the far side of the flats. You cross the drove and you walk it. It is a full day for a child, and it is nothing for a punt. Tamsin looked at the copper in his hand for a long moment. Then she looked past him up the beach, to where a woman in the doorway of the harbor-master's shed had stopped sweeping and was watching, and to where 2 of the coopers had looked up from their hoops, and to where 100 yards down, on the deck of the nearest salt barge, a broad, slow man sitting on a coil of rope had turned his head. I did not know what any of that was. I did not understand a thing that was happening. I was a man with a tar brush. "How's your ma'am?" said Tamsin. The boy did not answer. "Comb." "She's not there any more," he said to his boots. "She was there in the spring." I put the brush down. Tamsin wiped her hands very carefully on her thighs, one and then the other, the way she does before a job, and she stood up and she said, "Right. Well, that's a copper for a crossing, and I'm afraid I can't take you across." I turned round. I do not know what was on my face. I know she saw it because she gave me one flat look and it said, unmistakably, "Shut your mouth." The boy's fist closed again. "I can't take passengers," said Tamsin. "That's the trouble. Passengers are a great deal of trouble, and I've a load of empty barrels wants shifting up to Cobb Landing and no one to hold the rope." She looked down at him. "Can you hold a rope?" The boy looked up. "Because I'll pay a copper for that," she said. "It's dull work, You sit on the middle thwart with the rope in both hands and you don't let go of it, and if I say let go you let go, and if I don't say it you hold on if the sky falls in. That's the whole of it. A copper. The beach was quiet. "I've got a copper," said the boy. "I know, keep it, that's yours." She held out her hand. "This one's mine and I'm giving it to you for the work." She took her copper out of the tin by the step. I had seen inside that tin. I had seen inside it that morning. There was that one and there were two more and there was a bone button. And she put it in the boy's hand. And she closed his fingers on it and she said, "Now barrels." We loaded 11 empty barrels that did not need to go to Cobb. I know they did not need to go to Cobb because 10 days later I watched them come back. And because Cobb Landing is a rotten stump of a jetty with a farm behind it that takes salt fish and not one barrel of anything in a year. She rode a boy 4 miles across the flats on the strength of 11 empty barrels and a fiction, and she paid him a copper she needed. And when we got there, she sat on the thwart and let him climb out and run up the field to a woman standing at a gate with her hand over her mouth. And she did not wave. And she did not watch them very long. And she turned the boat round. Halfway back she said, "Say it. You could have simply taken him." "No. He'd have gone all the same. He'd have gone as a boy taken over free because his mother's dead," said Tamsin. "He'll be a man in this town in 9 years. He'll cross with me for the rest of his life. He'll remember one of those two things and he'll be right either way and I get to choose which." She set the pole. "It's not charity if he earns it." I sat in the bow of that boat. Understand, I had spent 11 years being told what I was. I was the king. I was strong. I was fair. I was cold. I was a good judge. I was a poor husband to my kingdom. Men had made speeches about me in my hearing. I had never once, not once in my life, been in the presence of a thing so plainly and entirely good that it made no sound at all. The tide was going out under us. The sun was on the water. My hands were on the oar and they were not shaking, and had not shaken in 6 days, and I looked at them and then at her back, and I stopped pretending to myself, then and there, in the middle of the bright flats, that I was ever going to be able to marry Ondine Varick. I did not fall in love with Tamsin Farrow because they insulted her. I want that to be clear before I tell you what they did. Nothing is more insulting than to be loved for one's worst hour. If I had come to her only after the fair, if the beginning of it had been I saw them take everything from you and my heart turned over, she would have been right to spit at me, and she would have been right to spit at me for the rest of my life. I fell in love with her on the 8th day, watching her lie to a child for his own dignity, on the strength of 11 barrels that nobody wanted, 4 miles from anywhere, with nobody watching except a hired hand who did not exist. That night I could not eat. She noticed because she notices. She notices the way other people breathe. "You've the look of a man about to tell me something," she said. "Yes." "Is it about your hands?" I went still. The fire cracked. Kip lifted his head. "What about my hands?" I said. "They shook," said Tamsin, poking the fire. "The first 2 days. Badly the first morning on the causeway. I thought you were cold, and then I thought you were frightened, and then I thought neither, because a frightened man's hands shake at something and yours were shaking at nothing." She turned the stick over. "Then they stopped. I thought perhaps you'd been drinking and had left off." She glanced up. "Was it that?" "No." "Well," said Tamsin, "good." And she stood, and she took the pot off the hook, and she went to bed. I sat by the fire of a woman who had noticed in 48 hours what my own physicians, my own counsel, my own marshal, and my own mother had not noticed in 4 years. And I looked at my steady hands in the firelight, and I did the accounts of my entire reign, and they came out very badly indeed. The Salt Fair opens on the 6th day of the last week of midsummer, and it runs a week, and it is the loudest and best and brightest thing in the estuary and possibly in my kingdom. 200 boats come in. They come up from the deep-water villages and down the coast, rowed on carts and across the flats at low water on the drove itself, and the shingle fills from the northern houses to the chapel with no door, and they pitch their trestles wherever there is space and quarrel about it cheerfully for a day, and then stop. There are barrels of oysters and barrels of samphire in brine, and barrels of salt so white it hurts to look at. There is a man selling roasted eels who has, I am reliably told, been selling roasted eels on that shingle since my father's father was a boy, and who has never in living memory changed his prices or his apron. There is a woman who sells nothing but buttons, horn buttons, shell buttons, bone buttons, a whole trestle of them in trays, and she sits behind it with her chin up like a duchess of the button trade, and her name is Ives, and she is 71, and I would give her a seat at my council table tomorrow if she would take it, which she would not. There is a ring of tar barrels at the top of the beach, 12 of them on iron stands, lit at dusk every night of the week, and there is no roof over any of it. On the first morning of the fair I carried oysters, 300 weight of them, up from the punt to the faro trestle, in a basket on my shoulder, and my back has never forgiven me. On the first afternoon I sold them badly, because I did not know the prices and Tamsin let me find that out at some cost, and by the evening I had learned that in fair landing you do not haggle with a man, you agree with him warmly and at length while removing his money. It was the best day of my life until then, and I did not know it. On the second morning of the fair, Ansel Kreb, the harbor master, stood up on a barrel at the top of the shingle and called the landing rights. It is done at 9, when the fair has had its breakfast, and before the day's serious drinking. Everybody stops. The trestles stay up and nobody buys anything for a quarter of an hour, and it is the only quarter of an hour in that whole week when 200 people are all doing the same thing. Kreb is a small, dry man of 60. He wets his lips before he speaks. He has done this every midsummer for 30 years, and his father did it before him, and he holds no office worth the name and is paid in oysters. "Coldwin Crossing," he said. The hands went up, not smartly, nobody is at drill. They went up in a lazy forest, the way hands do when a thing has always been true and everyone is thinking about their breakfast. Marrow Crossing. Up they went. Skene. Up. Varick the North Punt. Up. Varick the Deepwater Punt. Up. Varick the Drove Punt. Up, up, and a man near the front said something about how the Varricks had better not want a fourth, and there was a comfortable laugh, and Coyle Varick, standing with his arms folded at the front of the crowd in a good coat, smiled at the joke with the patience of a man who owns the joke. I was standing at the back with the culling rake still on my shoulder, because I had come straight up from the boat and had not thought to put it down. Tamsin was about 30 feet in front of me. She had her coat on and her hair up, and she was standing perfectly still, with her hands at her sides. "Faro Crossing," said Ansel Kreb. And Farron Varick, who was 26 years old and handsome as a spring morning, and who had never in his whole life been told no by anybody he could see, said clearly, pleasantly, not loudly, pitched to carry exactly as far as the eel cellar and no further. "For what?" The fair went quiet. "There's no second pole on that boat," he said. "There's no man on that boat. There's a woman on that boat who smells of the beds." Someone laughed. "I have counted them since. I have counted them 1,000 times, and I do not know the number, and I never will, and the best I can tell you is what I heard, which was that it was not everybody. It was not 200 people. It was perhaps 40 men, and it was one high startled laugh from a girl who put her hand over her mouth immediately afterwards, and it was over in 3 seconds, and the silence that came after it was the loudest thing on that beach. "There's the crossing," said Tamsin. She had not moved. "It's been a faro crossing 30 years. "It's been a faro crossing 30 years because Odell Faro could pole it," said Farron. And he was not shouting. That is the thing I could not have understood from a throne, and I want you to understand it now because it is the whole of what I learned in that town. He was not sneering. He was not cruel. He was being reasonable in the sun in front of everyone with real warmth in his voice, and half the men on that beach were nodding before they knew they were doing it. Nobody's saying a word against her, he said, opening his hands. There's not a soul here doesn't respect Odell's girl, but a crossing's a public safety, isn't it? That's the whole reason for the right. A boat wants two poles in a spring tide and she has one, and when she goes over, and she will go over, Tam, and everyone here knows she will, it'll be somebody's mother in that punt and somebody's child, and we'll all stand on this beach and say we saw it coming. He turned back to the fair, easy, sorrowful. I'd rather see her fed than drowned. Nobody will marry into a boat that's going under. She'll be a mud wife, and she'll wed the mud, and there's honest work on our barges any day she wants it. Mud wife. He said it once. He said it kindly. He said it the way you would say poor thing. And 200 faces in the bright sun turned to look at her, to see how she would take it. She took it the way a piling takes a wave. She stood there in the light with her chin up and her hands at her sides, and she did not look at Farron Varick, and she did not look at the ground, and she looked at Ansel Krebs on his barrel, and she waited, because it was his to call. Krebs wet his lips. He looked at the sky, then he looked at Coyle Varick and away from him fast. Hands, he said. I watched the hands. I want to be careful here, because in the 19 years since, a great many men who were on that beach have told me in my own hall, over my own wine with their eyes shining, that they raised theirs. They did not. I was standing at the back with a rake on my shoulder and nothing to do but look, and I have the whole of it in me like a splinter, and I could still, if you woke me at 3 in the morning, draw you that crowd. 11 hands went up. Old Ives the button woman put hers up first, straight up, all the way you would put your hand up to answer a question you were certain of. 2 of the deep-water men from Skene put theirs up. A woman with a baby on her hip put hers up and then had to put it down to shift the baby and put it up again. The ill seller put his up, and his wife did not, and I have wondered about that supper ever since. And a boy of about 15 put his hand up high at once before he had looked at anybody. And then he saw his father's hands, which were in his pockets, and the boy's hand came down slowly in front of everybody, and his face went the color of the inside of a shell. I have made that boy a captain of my own guard. I have never told him why, and I never will. He was 15, and his father was standing beside him, and the whole town was watching, and there is not a man alive who would have done better at 15, and there are, I am sorry to say, about 189 men who did worse at 40. 11 hands out of 200. Coyle Varick did not raise his. He did not need to. He stood with his arms folded and his good coat, and he looked at his boots with an expression of decent regret. And nobody, I want this on the record because it is the thing that has kept me awake, nobody did anything wrong. Nobody struck her. Nobody seized her boat. No law was broken, no charter forged, no seal misused, no coin passed that I ever found. There was no villain on that beach to drag out and hang. There was a young man who had been clever in the sun and one word, and 189 people who had discovered that it was easier, on a fine warm morning with the fair going on, and the eels and the buttons, to keep their hands at their sides. Rights withdrawn, said Ansel Krebs to his own boots. Faro crossings closed. And then the fair went on. That is the part that I could never have imagined, not in 11 years, not from any throne in the world. It simply went on. Krebs got down off his barrel. Somebody wanted eels. A cart came down the shingle and the crowd opened for it and closed again. 2 coopers went back to their hoops and the hammering started up. The whole enormous bright noise of the salt fair came back in over that beach in less than a minute, the way the tide comes over the drove, without hurrying, without any interest at all in who was still standing there. And behind me, as I turned, I heard a woman say to another woman, "Mud wife," trying it out, the way you try a coin on your teeth. Tamson walked back through them to the shingle. She did not hurry, and she did not look at anyone, and she did not touch anybody, and they got out of her way in ones and twos without seeming to. And one man said, "Tam," and she went past him. She walked the whole length of that beach through the fair she had come to sell oysters at, past her own trestle with her own oysters on it, and I followed her carrying a culling rake like an idiot, and everybody watched us go. At the water's edge she stopped. Nettle was up on the shingle where we had left her, tarred and black and shining wet, with the poles shipped along the thwarts. Tamsin put one hand flat on the side of the boat and stood a moment with her head down. I said, "Tamsin, don't. They're wrong. I know what they are." She lifted her head. Her eyes were completely dry and completely furious and clearer than any water in that estuary, and she was not looking at the town. "The tide's at 4, she said. "If we don't cull tonight we don't eat Thursday, and I have a boat to keep tarred and a dog that can't swim. So, are you coming?" She looked at me for the first time. "Or are you going to stand on my shingle and be sorry at me? I have been given titles by better men than me. I have had a crown put on my head by a priest of the moon with 2,000 people watching. Nobody has ever handed me anything as heavy as that." "I'm coming," I said. We culled that night by lantern at the bottom of the tide, in 2 feet of cold water half a mile out, with the lights of the salt fair strung along the shingle behind us, and the noise of it coming across the flats, very small and very clear, singing, and a fiddle, and once a great burst of laughter from the tar barrels. We worked 4 hours. She did not say one word about the fair, not one. I raked and I broke the clumps against my knee, and I threw the small ones back and I filled the basket, and about halfway through the night I lifted a rake load out of the black water, and the whole streaming mass of it went silver in the lantern light for a second, every shell running with light, and Tamsin straightened up 20 feet away with her hands on the small of her back and looked at it. "Not bad," she said, "for a hand." And she bent down and went back to work. I stood in the water of my own kingdom in the dark, half a mile out, with a rake in my 2 steady hands and the woman they had called the mudwife breaking oysters on her knee beside me, and the tide already beginning, somewhere out past the kettle, to turn. Midsummer's Eve was the 2nd day of the fair. The landing feast is on the last night of it. My procession, 60 horses, my marshal, my banner, my mother's brother with the gray wolf cloak folded across his saddle bow, was coming down the coast road and would arrive on that beach in 5 days. I had 5 days to decide what kind of man was going to get off that horse. 9 days is a long time to watch a town not look at somebody. I had thought, sitting on the shingle that first morning with my hands in front of me, that there would be a reckoning, that the eel seller would come down the beach and say something, or that the men who had not laughed would find each other, or that shame would work in fair landing the way it works in a hall, quickly in the open, with somebody standing up. Nothing of the kind happened. What happened was subtler and much worse. They were kind to her. Mag Kreb, the harbormaster's wife, brought down a pot of samphire on the 3rd day and left it on the bottom step and went away without knocking. A cooper who had kept his hands in his pockets sent his boy over with a new bung for the water barrel, no charge, no message. 2 of the deep-water men from Skene, who had raised their hands and lost, stopped at the trestle and bought oysters they did not want at a price that was an insult in the other direction. And Tamsin took their money and thanked them and sold them the oysters. And when they had gone, she stood looking at the coins in her palm for a while and then put them in the tin. Nobody said the word again where she could hear it. Everybody said it where she could not. I heard it 4 times in 9 days at the trestles, behind a stack of barrels, from a man arguing with his brother about something else entirely, who used it as a comparison. Like the mudwife. Already it had come loose from her. Already it was a thing you could call anything. And every morning she got up before the tide and worked. And every afternoon she pulled Nettle out to the drove and sat in her on the stone at the crossing hour with the pole across her knees, and took nobody across, because she was not permitted to take anybody across. That was the 9th day of it, and the 10th and the 11th. "Why do you go out?" I asked her on the 10th. "Because I've a boat and there's a crossing. They won't get in." "That's their business," said Tamsin. "Being there is mine." Twice in those days somebody wanted to. On the 10th day 2 women down from the hill farms with a basket between them came to the edge of the stone and looked at Nettle and looked back up the shingle at the Varick punt, where Farron's cousin sat with his boots on the gunwale, and one of them said, "Oh, Tam, love, I'd sooner," and stopped, and Tamsin said, quite easily, "The other boat's a copper and he'll take your basket up for you," and they went and thanked her, and one of them looked back. On the 11th day, a man got in. He was a stranger, a wool buyer off the coast road who knew nothing about anything, and he stepped down into Nettle and sat and said, "Fair landing, if you please." And Tamsin said, "I can't take you, sir. Boat's not licensed." He said, "What?" "That punt there, he'll have you across for a copper." The wool buyer looked at the Varick punt, and looked at the tarred black boat he was already sitting in, and looked up at the woman standing over him with the pole, and said the most obvious thing in the world, which was, "Then, what are you doing out here?" She did not answer that. She helped him up onto the stone with a hand under his elbow, and he went off to the other punt shaking his head, and I sat in the bow of a boat that was not allowed to move and watched her put the pole across her knees again and look out at the water. She had not cried once. Not on the beach, not that night, not in 9 days, and she has told me since that she did not cry about it at all, not ever, not once in 19 years, and I believe her, and I have never entirely got over it. Padraig Munt came down on the 11th evening. He stood at the bottom of the steps in the last of the light with his cap in his 2 hands. Kip went down and put his head against his knee, and Padraig scratched it without looking at it, because his eyes were on the top step, where Tamsin had come out and was standing with her arms folded. They looked at each other for a while. He did not say anything. I watched a big, slow, decent man stand at the bottom of a woman's steps for something close to a full minute with his mouth open twice, and nothing came, and at last he shut it, and put his cap on and turned, and walked back up the shingle in the dark toward the barge lights. Tamsin watched him the whole way. "He wanted to say he'd raise his hand next year," she said. "There isn't a next year. The right's called once and it's called." "He knows that." "Of course he knows that. That's why he couldn't say it." She rubbed her palms on her thighs, one and then the other. "Now he's got to carry that up the beach, and I couldn't help him, because if I'd helped him it'd have been me forgiving him, and he'd have taken it, and he'd never have got out from under it as long as he lived." She turned to go in. "Let him carry it a bit. He's strong enough." Undine Varick came on the 12th morning, alone, on foot, in a plain gray dress with her hair pinned like anybody's, and I did not see her come because I was under the house tarring the seams, and she did not see me because nobody ever saw me. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Tamsin Farrow," she said. "Miss Varick." I lay on my back under the boards with a tar brush going cold in my hand, 4 feet from the 2 of them, and I did not move, and I am not going to pretend to you that I would have moved if I could. "I'm to be married on Saturday," said Undine. "So I hear. Congratulations." "Do you know to whom?" "The king," said Tamsin. "Everybody knows. There's a boy in this town been shouting it up and down the shingle for a week with a stick." There was a pause. When Undine spoke again, there was something under her voice that I had not expected, and that made me, lying in the dark on the wet stones, deeply ashamed. "I have never met him," she said. "No. They tell me he's a big man and hard to talk to." "That be my guess." "My brother," said Undine Varick, "is a fool, my father is not. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes. Farron did that to you on that beach because he is 26 and wanted the fair to laugh." A long breath. "My father let him." The tide was coming in under the house. I could hear it, the long soft hiss, the water finding the barnacles on the stilts. Why are you here, Miss Varick? I don't know, said Ondine. That is exactly what she said. I have never told her that I heard it. She stood at the bottom of those steps for perhaps 10 seconds more, in a plain gray dress. On the morning her marriage was 5 days off, and then she said, in an entirely different and much brighter voice, "There's a good ash pole on our west barge. It was your father's second pole. Padraig brought it across when he came to us, and it's been in the rack since March and nobody's touched it." "It's not mine." "No," Ondine agreed, "it's not." And she went away up the shingle. I lay under the boards until I could not hear her boots, and then I lay there some time after that. I told Tamsin on the 12th night. I had rehearsed it, which was my great mistake. I stood up from her fire in her own house with my hands empty, and I said, "I am Halric of Muirholt." And I heard how it sounded. A stone dropped down a well, and no splash, only the sound of it going, and I kept talking, because there was nothing else to do. I told her about the borrowed coat and the boy who took my horse back at the coast road, about the drove and the heron and how I had turned round twice like a horse in a burning stable, about the council and the tolls and the letters written in one hand with different names at the bottom, about Ondine Varick, whom I had never met, and the tide charters and the 40 quiet years, about the procession, which was 2 days down the coast road, and would come onto that shingle on the last night of the fair, with 60 horses and a banner. She listened to every word of it with her arms folded, standing by her own hearth. Kip put his chin on her boot. When I had finished, I said the part I had rehearsed the hardest and believed the most, and I said it well, and I have wished ever since that I had said it badly. "I will have the crossing back," I said, "whatever it takes, and I am asking you to be my Luna and my wife. I have never asked anyone. I did not know it was in me to ask." The fire cracked. "No," said Tamsin Farrow. I did not understand her. "I want that written down plainly, because it is the truest thing about me. I stood in that room, a grown man, a king, and I did not understand her, and my very first feeling before the grief, before anything decent at all, was she does not know what she is refusing." "Tamsin." "Sit down," she said. "You're too big to argue with standing." I sat down. She did not. She stood by her fire with her arms folded, and she looked at me the way she looks at weather. "12 days ago," she said, "a man with no coppers came off the drove in my boat, and I gave him the heel of the loaf. I've fed you 12 nights. I've watched you learn to rake, which you're bad at, and pole, which you're worse at, and I've watched you carry oysters up that beach until you couldn't lift your arms and never once complain, and I've watched you sit in my boat while I ferried a motherless boy on 11 barrels that no one wanted and say nothing." She stopped. "And now you tell me you're the king. Well, all right. Then, so what have you had?" said Tamsin. "You've had 12 days of a woman being good to a beggar. That's what you're in love with. And it's a very cheap thing to be in love with, Halric, and you got it cheap, and I don't want to be the lesson you learned on the flats." "It is not." And she said over me quietly, and this was the blow, "You're asking me tonight." I said nothing. "Tonight," she said, "this week." The week they stood in the sun and took my father's right off me with their hands in their pockets, and a boy called me a name in front of 200 people, and I walked the length of my own beach, and nobody said one word. Her voice did not rise at all. "You're asking me in the 1 week of my life when I have nothing." "I don't care what you have." "I know you don't. That's not the trouble." She sat down at last across the fire and leaned forward with her forearms on her knees like a man at a tavern table. "Think now. Think about it properly, because you're not stupid, and I won't have you being stupid at me. If I take your hand this week, if the king comes down that shingle in his cloak and puts a crown on the mudwife, then what have they all got for the rest of my life?" I looked at her. "Got the story," said Tamsin. "Poor Tam Farrow. She'd have gone under, you know, boat and all. Lucky for her the king fancied her." She smiled, and it was the worst thing I ever saw on her face. "They were right, do you see, about what I was, about a woman alone on that water, and I was rescued from it by a man, which is what they always said would have to happen, and every one of those 200 people gets to be right for the rest of their lives, and every one of them gets to feel kind about it. And I'd have taken their kindness. The fire popped, Kip sighed and stretched out. And you, she said, would have taken the only thing on this earth they could not vote away from me, and you'd have taken it while being good to me, which is why I'd never have been able to say a word about it, and why I'd have hated you in about 9 years. I said, and I have thought about this sentence more than any other I have ever spoken, then I will make them give it back. She sat back. You will make them, said Tamsin Farrow. And she looked at me for a long moment, and something went out of her face, and what came into it was not anger. It was tiredness and a kind of pity, and I would rather she had thrown the pot at me. Yes, she said, that's the trouble, that is exactly the trouble. She stood up. 200 hands, Halric, not written anywhere. No roll, no seal, nothing to seize, nothing to sign. 300 years, and there's not one thing in it that a king can touch, and that's what it's for. She took the pot off the hook. You could stand on that beach and order them to raise their hands, and they'd raise them, every one, and they'd raise them for you and not for me. And I'd have a right that a king gave me, and my father had one that his neighbors gave him, and they are not the same thing. And if you can't see the difference, then I've fed you for 12 nights for nothing. I sat by her fire with my hands hanging between my knees. Then what am I to do? I said. And I meant it as a defeat, and she took it as a question, and she stopped at the door with the pot in her hands and considered it seriously, which is the mercy she gives everybody. I don't know, said Tamsin. You're the king, go and be one. She looked back. You've been a very poor hand, and I'll want the coat back. The door shut. I stood on the shingle of Fair Landing in the dark with the tide going out and my hands shaking like a man with a fever, because, for the first time in 12 days, I was not holding anything at all. I met the procession at Holland Cross at noon on the last day of the fair. 60 horses. My marshal, who took one look at my face and said nothing, which is why he is my marshal. My mother's brother with the wolf cloak. A boy holding my horse, who was so relieved to see me that he cried, and pretended it was the dust. They put me in the black and the silver. They shaved me, and they put the circlet in my hair and the gray cloak on my shoulders, and my uncle handed me my gloves, and I looked at my hands and put the gloves on. We came down the coast road at dusk, 7 miles at a walk. I want to tell you what I did on that road, because I have never told anyone, and because if I leave it out I am building myself a better man than the one who wrote it. I composed it, all of it, mile after mile. I would come down onto that shingle in the firelight, and I would let Coil Varick make his speech, and I would break the marriage with one sentence and watch his face. I would have Farron Varick brought out in front of the whole fair, and I would ask him, in my own voice, to say the word again. Say it again. Say it to my face. I would strip the Thai charters from that family and give them to the Deepwater men, and I would put Coil Varick's barges under a royal hand for a generation, and I would have Ansel Krebs on his barrel call the Pharaoh crossing again, and I would stand behind him with my arms folded, and I would look at those 200 people, one at a time, until every hand on that beach went up. I rehearsed the sentences. Some of them were extremely good. I had one for the boy of 15, and I had one for the ill-seller's wife. And about a mile out from the landing, with the noise of the fair already coming up the road and the tar barrels lit against a green sky, I understood something. Every single thing I had composed would work. I could do all of it with one hand before the moon was properly up, and no man on that beach would lift a finger, and it would be called justice, and my marshal would approve of it, and Coil Varick would deserve it, and the songs would be very fine. And when it was done, Tamsin Farrow would be a woman who had been avenged by a king. She would have her crossing because I gave it to her. She would have her name back because I took a boy's name away from him. and every soul in that town would look at her for the rest of her life and see, standing behind her, a man on a horse. They had been right, and she had been rescued. I would have spent 9 days building the exact thing she had refused, and I would have called it love, and it would have been about me from the first sentence to the last. My hands were shaking on the reins. I let them. We came onto the shingle at full dark, and the salt fare fell silent in front of my banner, the way water goes off a rock. Somebody dropped a barrel. It rolled down the beach a long way, through the whole quiet, and nobody went after it. A dog barked once and thought better of it. 200 faces, and then 300, turned up toward the horses, and men pulled their caps off, and the tar barrels burned in their iron stands and threw the light of them right across that crowd. And past the crowd the flats went out silver and enormous and empty under the last of the sky. A quarter-mile off, black on the mud, Nettle lay where the tide had left her. There was no lamp lit in the Pharaoh house. Coil Varick met me at the barrels with his son at his shoulder and his daughter on his arm, and he had a speech, and the speech was very good. It was warm and it was brief, and it named my father twice and asked nothing, and no man who heard it could have found a fault in it. I stood at the top of the shingle in my cloak and let him finish. Then I looked at Farron. He knew. I watched him know. It went across his face in stages, the way a lamp is turned down. I had passed within 6 feet of that young man 12 times in 12 days, carrying baskets, carrying barrels black to the elbows with tar, and he had never once seen me, because there was nothing there to see. And now he was looking at a big shaven man in a gray wolf cloak with a circlet in his hair, and something in his memory turned over, and the blood went out of his face and did not come back. He did not say anything. He has never said anything. And here is what I did not do. I did not have him seized. I did not name what he had done, or repeat the word, or make him repeat it. I did not touch the charters, or the barges, or his father. I did not look at the eel-seller's wife. I had ridden 7 miles composing every one of those things, and I had them all in my mouth like coins, and I let them lie there. I said to Coil Varick, in front of everybody, "There will be no marriage." He began beautifully to speak. I let him get through most of it. Ondine Varick, on his arm, looked at me with her chin level and did not blink, and I have been grateful to her ever since for the fact that she did not, in that moment, look relieved, because if she had, the whole beach would have seen it. When he had finished, I said, "I have been in your town 12 days. And then I told them. Not well. I want that on the record because I have heard it told since as a great speech, and it was not. There was no shape to it, and I lost the thread twice. It was a big man in a cloak on a beach saying plain sentences to people who had begun, very slowly, to look at one another. I said, I came down here in a borrowed coat to have a look at what my council wanted me to marry. I stood on your drove like a fool, and the water came. And I did not know it was coming, and I would have drowned there in front of your town. I said, I was taken off it by a ferry-woman who charged me 2 coppers I did not have, and put me to work instead. I have culled your beds at the bottom of the tide. I have carried 300 weight of oysters up this shingle. I have tarred a punt and shifted your barrels and eaten in a house on that stretch of beach for 12 nights and slept under a sail, and not one of you knew me. I said, not one of you knew me because not one of you looked at me. I was a hand in a boat. There is nothing to see there. I said, and it went very quiet, I said. 9 days ago, I stood at the back of this fair with a rake on my shoulder while you took the Pharaoh crossing away. I counted the hands. There were 11. Nobody moved. Somewhere down the beach a tar barrel spat. I said, I am not going to give it back to her. And I heard 300 people not understand me. I have no power here, I said. The landing right has never in 300 years been in the gift of a king, and it is not in mine tonight, and if I stood on this shingle and handed it to her out of my hand, it would be worth nothing at all, and she knows that better than I do. I looked out at the flats, at the black shape of the punt on the mud, which is why she is not standing here. And then I said the only part of it that I am not ashamed of. I took my gloves off. I have hidden a tremor in my hands for 4 years, I said, and held them up in the firelight so that the front of the crowd could see and the front of the crowd saw. Since my father died, it comes in the mornings and it comes when I sign my name. I hold a cup at every council in this kingdom so that no man will notice and no man ever has. My voice was not steady either. That is what your king is. I have spent 4 years making certain that not one of you would look directly at me, and it worked. There was no sound on that beach at all. Now, I said, call the crossings. Ansel Krebs was 60 years old and had done this every midsummer for 30 of them and his father before him, and he had never in his life had a king on his shingle. He stood there. He wet his lips. He looked at the barrel and somebody pushed it toward him, and he got up on it slowly in front of 300 people and he said, Faro crossing. Nothing happened. I have lived a long time in the space of those 4 or 5 seconds. Nobody moved. 300 people stood in the firelight with the sea coming in behind them, and I understood, with perfect clarity, that I had gambled Tamsin Farrow's life on a thing I had known for 12 days and did not own, and that if this failed I would have taken from her the last thing she had, which was the ability to say that at least she had never asked them for anything. And then, in the middle of the crowd, old Ives the button woman put her hand up. Straight up, all the way. The way you put your hand up to answer a question you are certain of. She did not look round to see who was with her. She had not looked round 9 days before either. The boy of 15 put his hand up. And this time he left it there. His father looked at him. I saw it. The whole beach saw it. And the man's hand came out of his pocket and went up slowly, as though it were being drawn out of him on a line, and he was not looking at me or at Krebs but at the side of his son's face. Then it went through them. Not fast. It was not a wave and it was not a cheer and nobody shouted. It went through that crowd the way the tide goes over the drove, without hurrying, without any interest at all in who was standing in it. A hand and 3 hands, and the 2 Skene men, and the eel seller and the eel seller's wife, and Mag Krebs and the cooper who had sent the bung, and a woman with a baby on her hip who had to shift the baby and put her hand up again, exactly as she had done 9 days before. And Padraig Mund on the edge of the crowd with his cap crushed in his other fist and his face working, and it went back and back into the dark beyond the barrels where I could not see, and it kept going. And near the front, without any expression at all, Farron Varick raised his hand. I have never asked him why. I never will. I do not think he could tell me. He raised it and it cost him nothing and it was too late and it counted. All 4 of those things are true at once, and I stopped 19 years ago trying to make them agree. Ansel Krebs looked out over the beach for a long time. He was crying, I think, though he would deny it, and he is dead now and cannot. Rights restored, he said. Faro crossings open. And then there was nothing left to do. I stood there in a wolf cloak in front of 300 people with my hands bare and empty, and there was no ceremony to perform, and nothing to sign and nobody to punish, and no woman to claim, because I had promised myself on the coast road that I would not, and because she was a quarter of a mile away in the dark and had refused me. So I sat down on a barrel, like a hired hand at somebody else's feast. Ondine Varick walked away up the beach toward the boats, alone, and did not look back, and I did not stop her, and by Michaelmas she had bought her own barge and by the following spring 2 more, and she has never in 19 years accepted an invitation to my table, and every year at midsummer she sends Tamsin a barrel of salt. The tide came in at 10:30. You hear it before you see it in Fair Landing, a long soft hiss out on the flats, like grain being poured, and it goes on for a quarter of an hour. The fair had gone strange and quiet. People had drifted down toward the water without meaning to, the way people do, and so it happened that most of that town was already turned around and facing the flats when Nettle came up out of the dark on the new tide with a lantern in her bow. She poled her in to the foot of the shingle below the barrels, and stepped out into a foot of black water in her boots. She had a pole in her hand, not hers, the good ash one, Odelfero's second pole, that had gone across to the Varick barges in March with Padraig and stood in a rack untouched all summer, and that had been carried down to her steps at some hour of that evening by somebody, with no message and no apology, and left there. And she had picked it up and looked at it and used it immediately, which is the only thanks that woman has ever given anyone in her life. She came up the shingle. 300 people got out of her way, and this time they did it as though they were doing something, and she did not look at any of them. She stopped in front of me. I stood up off the barrel. She looked at me for a while, at the black and the silver, the circlet, the wolf cloak that my father had worn, and then down at my hands, which were shaking, and which I did not hide, and I watched her see it. "They gave it back," she said. "You gave it back." I stood in the light. She turned the pole slowly in her hands. "You told them about your hands, in front of all of them." "Yes." "That was stupid," said Tamsin Farrow, "and I'll not have you doing it again." And she held the ash pole out to me, exactly as she had held out an oar on the drove 12 days before, exactly as flatly, and I took it. And she reached over and turned it around inside my two fists. "Backwards," she said. Then she put her hand flat against the back of mine, and folded my fingers shut on the ash with her own fingers, and held on. The shaking stopped. She looked up at me with the firelight going all over her face and 300 people watching, and she said, so quietly that nobody on that beach but me has ever known what it was, "Ask me now." I asked her. I have been asked a great many times what she answered by ambassadors and by my own children, and I have never told anyone, and I am not going to begin at this age. It was not long. It was not for the fair. But she came up that beach with me afterwards with her boots full of water and her hair down and the whole estuary starring. And at the tar barrels she stopped, because Farron Varick was standing there. Everybody waited. "Farron," she said. "Tamsin," he said. "That is all. That is the whole of it, and that is all there has ever been. He has never apologized, and she has never asked him to. He is 45 now. He keeps the tide lamps on the West Shoal, and he keeps them very well, and he lost his father's charters to his sister's cleverness and not to my hand, and twice a year at the fair he and my wife stand side by side at the harbor-master's shed and discuss the shoal for 10 minutes. He says, 'Ma'am.' She says, 'Farron.' I have watched them do it, and I cannot tell you what either of them is thinking, and the story does not owe you that. She would not have a coronation. She said if there was to be a crown it could be brought down to the boat. It was. She wore it for 11 minutes on the middle thwart of nettle with the priest standing in the shallows holding up his robes, and then she put it in the tin with the coppers and the bone button, and it is there now. We were married on the shingle at low water in October, which the priests of the moon disliked very much, because there is no roof there and no ceiling and nothing at all between the two of us and the sky. The whole of Fair Landing stood out on the mud in their boots. Old Ives gave her away. Padraig Mund carried the ring in his cap and dropped it and found it, and everybody pretended not to have seen. She kept the crossing, of course. There was a great deal of discussion in my council about what a Luna of Muirholt could and could not be permitted to do, and she sat through all of it with her arms folded, and when they had finished, she said that the Faroe crossing had run for 30 years and would run for 30 more, and that any man in the room who felt strongly was welcome to come out on the 4 o'clock tide and say so. Nobody came. Marshal Bligh came once in the 3rd year out of pure courage, and was sick over the side within sight of the kettle, and has never mentioned the matter again. The tremor never came back. I have thought about that for 19 years, and I have decided there is no magic in it, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not stood in cold water at 4 in the morning with a rake for 4 hours. A man's hands shake when he is holding a thing he must not drop and has told nobody about. Put him to honest work beside a woman who does not care who he is. Let him say the true sentence out loud on a beach in front of everybody, and see what his hands do. My wolf woke that autumn. He is old and quiet and unremarkable, and he likes the flats. She calls me boat hand. She has called me that for 19 years. She has called me that in front of ambassadors and in front of my mother, and once, memorably, in front of a delegation of the Southern Pax, who thought it was a title of some antiquity and used it themselves all evening. Combe, the boy with the copper, is 25 and pilots the deep-water barges out of the landing and crosses with her, and pays 2 coppers, and she takes them. And every morning of my life, before the sun and before the council and before the crown, I go down through the wet grass in my old coat and put Nettle in the water. The tide is coming or the tide is going, and either way it does not care in the least what I am. My wife comes down after me with the bread. She stands in the stern with the pole and looks out at the flats going silver all the way to the sky, and says nothing at all for a while. And then most mornings, without turning round, "You've got it backwards,"